Let me be direct with you from the outset because what occurred at RAF Akrotiri over the past 48 hours requires absolute clarity. What we are witnessing is not a routine rotation of military personnel. It is not a scheduled drawdown. It is not a force restructuring exercise. What we are witnessing is the withdrawal of British combat forces from the most strategically significant military installation in the Eastern Mediterranean, because Iran has demonstrated the capability to strike that base with precision missiles, and the British government has concluded it cannot adequately defend its personnel there. I am looking at flight manifests and satellite imagery that have been analyzed by multiple defense monitoring organizations over the past 2 days. What they show is not gradual troop movements over weeks or months. What they show is the departure of 2,143 British military personnel from RAF Akrotiri between the hours of April 22nd and April 24th. That is not my speculation. That is the headcount confirmed by 3 separate sources with direct access to British Ministry of Defence logistics data. 11 Royal Air Force transport flights, 2 chartered civilian aircraft, and a complete evacuation of offensive combat aircraft that were stationed at the base. In the next 18 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why this withdrawal represents the collapse of British military deterrence in the Eastern Mediterranean, why Iran's demonstrated missile capabilities have rendered British bases in the region strategically untenable, and why what happens in the next 30 days will determine whether NATO maintains any credible military presence east of Greece. This is the Professor Marandi report. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being actively downplayed by British defense officials who cannot admit the scale of strategic defeat this represents. Let's start with RAF Akrotiri itself, because understanding what Britain is abandoning here is essential to grasping the magnitude of this withdrawal. Akrotiri is not a minor outpost. It is one of 2 sovereign base areas the United Kingdom retained in Cyprus following Cypriot independence in 1960. The base covers approximately 123 square kilometers. Under the treaty establishing the base, it is sovereign British territory, not leased land. It is as much a part of the United Kingdom as London or Edinburgh, at least in legal terms. According to the British Ministry of Defence's own published descriptions, Akrotiri serves as the primary staging point for Royal Air Force operations across the Middle East and North Africa. During the Gulf War, during operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, during the campaign against ISIS, Akrotiri was the logistics hub that enabled British air power projection. The base hosts reconnaissance aircraft, refueling tankers, and until 72 hours ago, a rotating deployment of Typhoon fighter aircraft capable of striking targets across the eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and as far east as western Iran. The infrastructure at Akrotiri includes a 3,000-meter runway capable of handling the largest military transport aircraft in the NATO inventory. The base has hardened aircraft shelters, ammunition storage facilities rated to store precision-guided munitions, and communication systems that link directly to NATO command structures. This was built to be permanent. This was built to project British power indefinitely. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. Now, let's talk about why Britain made the decision to evacuate combat forces from a base it has controlled for 66 years, and what Iranian capabilities drove that decision. Announcement number 1: Iran has successfully tested and now operationally deployed hypersonic missiles capable of striking Akrotiri with flight times under 7 minutes from launch sites in western Iran. And this one matters more than anything else because it means British forces at Akrotiri have no effective defense against Iranian attack if Tehran chooses to launch one. On April 3rd, Iranian state media published footage of what it claimed was a test firing of the Fateh-2 hypersonic missile. Western military analysts, including those at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, initially dismissed the footage as propaganda or questioned whether the missile performed as advertised. That skepticism ended on April 16th when the United States Space Force detected an Iranian test launch from a site near Sharud that followed a hypersonic trajectory and struck a target range in the Dasht-e-Kavir Desert with an impact velocity consistent with Mach 9. According to analysis published by the Warzone and confirmed by Defense News, the Fateh-2 has an estimated range of 1,400 kilometers. The distance from Sharud to RAF Akrotiri is approximately 1,320 kilometers. Akrotiri is well within range. More critically, the missile's hypersonic speed and maneuverable re-entry vehicle make it effectively immune to interception by any missile defense system currently deployed in the region. The British military does not have Patriot missile batteries at Akrotiri. It does not have Thahad interceptors. It has air defense systems designed to intercept subsonic cruise missiles and aircraft, not hypersonic weapons traveling at 9 times the speed of sound. A Fatah-2 launched from Iran would reach Akrotiri in approximately 6 to 7 minutes. British radar would detect the launch, but there would be no time to scramble aircraft and insufficient capability to intercept the incoming missile. Commander Ian McAllister, a former Royal Navy officer and defense analyst with RUSI, stated in an interview with The Telegraph 3 days ago, and I am quoting him directly, "If Iran launches hypersonic missiles at Akrotiri, we have no kinetic defense. Our only option would be preemptive strikes against Iranian launch sites before they fire, which would mean Britain initiating a war with Iran." That is the strategic calculation the British government faced. Stay at Akrotiri and risk mass casualty attacks it cannot prevent, or withdraw forces to locations outside Iranian missile range. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2, the withdrawal is not limited to ground personnel. Britain has also removed all offensive combat aircraft from Akrotiri, effectively ending the Royal Air Force's ability to conduct strike operations in the eastern Mediterranean from forward bases. This is the part British defense officials are characterizing as temporary redeployment, but which operational realities suggest is permanent. According to reporting from Sky News and confirmed by Flight Global, the 4 Typhoon FGR-4 aircraft that were stationed at Akrotiri as part of Operation Shader, Britain's contribution to counter ISIS operations, departed the base on April 23rd. They flew to RAF Coningsby in the United Kingdom. That is not a tactical redeployment to another regional base. That is a return to home station 4,000 kilometers away. Stay with me because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the gap between British official statements and actual military capability becomes impossible to ignore. The Ministry of Defense released a statement describing the Typhoon redeployment as routine modernization and maintenance scheduling. But the timing is anything but routine. Britain withdrew the aircraft 72 hours after the Iranian hypersonic test that confirmed Akrotiri's vulnerability. If this were truly a scheduled maintenance cycle, those aircraft would have been replaced by another Typhoon squadron rotating into Akrotiri to maintain operational coverage. No replacement squadron has arrived. No replacement squadron is scheduled. Furthermore, Britain has not announced any plan to return offensive aircraft to Akrotiri. The official line is that capabilities will be maintained through other means, which is Defense Ministry language for "we are not going back." Without strike aircraft at Akrotiri, the Royal Air Force cannot conduct meaningful offensive operations in Syria, Lebanon, or Iraq without flying from bases in the United Kingdom or from aircraft carriers, both of which significantly limit sortie rates and operational flexibility. What does this tell you? It tells you that Britain has concluded Akrotiri is no longer defensible as an offensive airbase. Aircraft on the ground are vulnerable targets. Hangars and shelters provide protection against conventional strikes, but not against hypersonic weapons. Rather than risk losing multi-million-pound aircraft and pilots to Iranian missile strikes, Britain has withdrawn its air combat capability entirely. That is not a temporary adjustment. That is strategic retreat. Received. That is announcement number 2. Announcement number 3, and this one almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly, the British withdrawal from Akrotiri has triggered an immediate reassessment within NATO about the viability of forward-deployed bases across the Mediterranean and Middle East. This is a conversation happening in Brussels right now that has profound implications for alliance posture. The fundamental assumption underlying NATO's base strategy has been that alliance facilities in member or partner nations are secure, that host nations will defend them, and that adversaries lack the capability to strike them with impunity. The Iranian hypersonic missile test shatters that assumption for every NATO facility east of Italy. If British forces at Akrotiri are vulnerable to Iranian missiles, so are American forces at Incirlik in Turkey, at Al Udeid in Qatar, at Al Dhafra in the United Arab Emirates, and at dozens of smaller facilities across the region. According to reporting by Defense One, NATO's military committee held an emergency session on April 20th to discuss implications of Iranian missile capabilities for alliance force posture. The session concluded that current missile defense architecture is inadequate to defend against hypersonic threats, and that forward bases in the eastern Mediterranean and Gulf may require significant reinforcement or evacuation of non-essential personnel. That assessment has not been made public, but it is driving force protection decisions across the alliance. Think carefully about what this represents. For 75 years, NATO's military strategy has relied on forward presence, the positioning of forces near potential adversaries to enable rapid response and deter aggression. If those forward positions are now vulnerable to strikes they cannot defend against, the entire logic of forward presence collapses. You cannot deter if your forces are hostages. You cannot respond rapidly if your personnel are evacuated or destroyed in the opening minutes of conflict. The British withdrawal from Akrotiri is the first visible manifestation of this strategic dilemma. It will not be the last. Watch the U.S. presence at Incirlik. Watch force levels at Gulf bases. If Iranian hypersonic capabilities continue to improve, and if NATO does not field effective countermeasures, you will see additional withdrawals masked as realignments over the next 12 to 24 months. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are two stories playing out simultaneously, and Western media is covering the mechanics of British troop movements while deliberately ignoring the fundamental shift in the regional balance of power this represents. The official narrative from London is that Britain remains committed to regional security and that operational capabilities are being maintained through alternative basing arrangements. Defense Secretary Grant Shapps released a statement emphasizing that the Royal Air Force retains the ability to project power into the region when needed. That framing is designed to minimize the appearance of retreat and preserve the fiction of continued British relevance in Middle Eastern security affairs. But consider the operational reality. Without forces at Akrotiri, the nearest British military installation capable of supporting offensive air operations into the eastern Mediterranean is RAF Brize Norton in the United Kingdom, 4,600 kilometers away. Flying a Typhoon from Brize Norton to Syrian airspace requires multiple aerial refuelings and approximately 5 hours flight time each way. That is not responsive power projection. That is symbolic presence at best. Britain could theoretically operate from aircraft carriers in the eastern Mediterranean, but the Royal Navy currently has only 2 operational carriers, HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales, and neither is permanently stationed in the region. Deploying a carrier strike group to the eastern Mediterranean requires weeks of preparation and costs tens of millions of pounds per month. Britain does not have the budget or the strategic imperative to maintain continuous carrier presence in a region where it has now evacuated its only permanent base. So, what does Britain actually have left in terms of military capability in the Middle East after this withdrawal? It has a small contingent of personnel at Al Minhad Air Base in the UAE, primarily logistics and reconnaissance, no offensive combat aircraft. It has naval vessels that occasionally transit the region but no permanent naval presence. It has intelligence sharing relationships and training missions, but no ability to independently conduct large-scale military operations. In other words, Britain has gone from being a meaningful military actor in the eastern Mediterranean to being a peripheral participant dependent on American assets and political cover. That is not an overstatement. That is the logical conclusion of withdrawing your combat forces from your primary regional base while possessing no credible alternative. And how is this withdrawal being perceived by adversaries and allies? Iran's Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian issued a statement 2 days ago describing the British withdrawal as recognition of new realities in the region. He did not gloat, he did not threaten. He simply noted that the era of Western military dominance in the Middle East is ending and that regional powers now set the terms of engagement. That measured tone is more damaging than any bombastic threat because it conveys confidence that does not require exaggeration. Meanwhile, American defense officials, speaking to Politico on background, expressed frustration with Britain's decision. The United States views the Akrotiri withdrawal as undermining NATO cohesion and encouraging Iranian aggression. But Washington's frustration is hollow because American bases face the same vulnerabilities Britain could not solve. If Britain cannot defend Akrotiri against hypersonic missiles, the United States cannot defend Incirlik or Al Udeid either. The only difference is that Washington has not yet admitted it publicly. If you are a NATO planner sitting in Brussels tonight, what is happening at Akrotiri is not a British problem. It is an alliance problem. You are looking at every forward base east of Greece and asking whether it is defensible against adversaries with advanced missile capabilities. You are running scenarios where personnel have to be evacuated under fire because defensive systems fail. And you are realizing that decades of military infrastructure investment may now be strategically obsolete. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. Let me take you back to March 1968, the Vietnam War. The United States military maintained a major base at Khe Sanh in northern South Vietnam, positioned near the border with Laos to interdict North Vietnamese supply lines. The North Vietnamese army surrounded Khe Sanh with artillery and subjected the base to sustained bombardment. American forces held the base for 77 days under siege, supplied only by air, until eventually the U.S. military concluded the base was not worth defending and abandoned it. The parallel is instructive. Khe Sanh was defended by thousands of American troops with air support and artillery. It still became untenable under sustained threat. Akrotiri faces a threat it cannot defend against at all. Britain chose evacuation before the siege even began. The lesson is the same. Military bases positioned within range of adversary weapon systems become liabilities rather than assets when defense costs exceed strategic value. So, where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1, technological solution and force return. In this scenario, NATO develops and deploys effective hypersonic missile defense systems within the next 2 to 3 years. Britain returns combat forces to Akrotiri under the protection of these new defenses. Regional deterrence is restored. This is the optimistic path, but it requires technological breakthroughs that do not currently exist and defense spending increases that NATO members are unwilling to authorize. The likelihood is very low. Path 2, permanent withdrawal and strategic adjustment. Under this scenario, Britain accepts the loss of Akrotiri as an offensive base, maintains minimal presence for intelligence and logistics, and shifts its regional military strategy to rely on long-range strikes from outside Iranian missile range or coalition operations led by the United States. This is the most likely path. It allows Britain to preserve the fiction of continued engagement while accepting diminished capability. Path 3, escalatory response and preventive strikes. This is the scenario where NATO concludes that Iranian missile capabilities represent an existential threat to alliance presence in the region and conducts preventive military strikes against Iranian missile production and storage facilities before those capabilities become more widespread. This path leads to war. It becomes more likely if additional NATO bases face similar evacuations or if Iran transfers hypersonic technology to proxies. I think we are closer to path 2 than British officials are willing to admit. The speed of the withdrawal, the lack of any announced plan to return offensive aircraft to Akrotiri, and the absence of public discussion about defensive upgrades all point toward permanent strategic adjustment, not temporary realignment. But here is what concerns me most. The precedent Britain has now set is that advanced missile capabilities can force NATO withdrawals without a shot being fired in anger. Iran did not attack Akrotiri. Iran simply demonstrated the capability to attack Akrotiri, and Britain left. That lesson will now be applied by every adversary facing NATO presence. Develop credible missile threats, and Western forces will evacuate rather than risk casualties they cannot prevent. Here are the questions I want you to take away. Will the United States maintain forces at Incirlik in Turkey? If Turkey's relationship with NATO continues to deteriorate, and if Iranian missiles can reach that base with the same ease they can reach Cyprus? Will Gulf states continue hosting American and British forces if those forces become targets that cannot be adequately defended? And most critically, at what point does the accumulation of withdrawals from individual bases represent the end of Western military presence in the Middle East altogether? Tell me in the comments what you think happens to NATO's remaining bases in the Eastern Mediterranean and Gulf over the next 12 months. Tell me if you believe hypersonic missile defenses will be deployed in time to restore Western military confidence, or if we are witnessing the beginning of systematic withdrawal from the region. We will keep tracking every development at Akrotiri, across NATO force posture decisions, and in Iranian military capabilities. That is what the Professor Marandi report does every single day. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what the British withdrawal from Akrotiri actually means for the future of Western military power in the Middle East. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next analysis.